Okay, now that previous lectures have set up kind of where each individual major Latin American nation is as the 1800s progresses into the end of the century, now we can talk about one of the major threats that continue to emerge on an increasing level throughout the 1800s to them, which is attempts at conquest or other types of control emanating from the United States. So the United States will take an increasingly aggressive stance toward Latin America from the 1820s forward, really ever since Latin America won its independence from Spain and Portugal. So that'll be our starting point in the 1820s, and we'll eventually get to around 1890 or so. So the first big thing to realize in the early 1820s is that most of these Latin American nations are becoming independent just after 1820, largely led by Mexico in 1821, as you can see with this map. Then you get Brazil and Chile, Argentina, and then the kind of northern South American nations, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, as they not only fought off the Spanish, but then tried to build their kind of northern continental superstate, the Gran Colombia of Simon Bolivar's vision. The United States obviously saw this going on. The United States had won its own independence from Britain in the 1780s. So the United States is about 40 years old as the 1820s gets going. And the United States has also been expanding itself. So by the 1820s, the United States is growing in power and influence and starts looking at the rest of the Western Hemisphere, trying to figure out what U.S. policy should be for the Western Hemisphere now that all these countries are becoming independent. So that stimulated a lot of discussion and debate and conversation in the United States about what the U.S. role should be as a possible leader of the Western Hemisphere, because the United States was, again, the first to run an anti-imperial revolution and lead its populations into a new independent phase. So in December 1823, the U.S. President James Monroe, as the president does pretty much every year, gives a speech to Congress. It becomes known as the State of the Union Address. And it's really just a kind of update. This is what has happened in the past year. This is my presidential vision for what should happen in the following year. This is the kind of path that we should follow. So the presidents do this every year and throughout U.S. history. The one in 1823 is a little bit different, though, because it includes a big statement about Latin America, because those nations were now newly independent. A lot of people in popular culture tend to think that this statement on Latin America dominated Monroe's address to Congress. It didn't. It was really only one little paragraph in a much longer speech. Okay, so what did the president tell Congress should be U.S. policy toward Latin America in this speech? He's mostly concerned about the idea that when these newly independent Latin American nations have broken away from Spain and are starting off on new governments, that a lot of them might be very weak, might be very prone to invasion from other Latin American nations, or even worse, in Monroe's mind, could be prone to invasion by other European countries that see this as an opportunity to reconquer some of those former colonies and turn them into their own colonies. Like, say, for instance, Mexico has broken away from Spain. Well, that might invite France or Britain or someone else to try to get into Mexico, conquer the place, and turn it into a French or a British or whatever other colony. So it'd be like Spain's loss is somebody else's gain. That was really the biggest thing that the United States was mostly concerned about. So it wanted to send a message to Europe, for the most part, to not even try it. So the United States basically offers a deal through what becomes known as this Monroe Doctrine, that the United States, on one hand, will promise not to intervene in the internal affairs or any of the wars that European powers fight against each other. So this is Monroe trying to say basically what's going on in Europe should really stay in Europe. Those are your problems on your side of the Atlantic Ocean. We're not interested in your problems, And so you solve your own problems, you do your own wars against each other. The United States is not going to be involved. So that's one side of this deal, or proposal at least. Another side is that the United States will accept any European colonies in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, that continue to exist. So basically, the United States recognizes that Europe still has some colonies around in the Western Hemisphere, and promises, again, to not interfere with the European control over those existing colonies. There are not many left in the Western Hemisphere by 1823, so it's really like the British own Canada, the British still largely control Jamaica, Spain still controls Cuba and Puerto Rico, but most of the rest of the Latin American nations have broken away and won their independence by that point. So the United States says, okay, well, European colonies that still exist, we're not going to try to mess with that either. You can still have your colonies. But the thing that the United States really wanted to take a stand against with this proposal is to close off the rest of the Western Hemisphere to future European colonization. So the Europeans, under this proposal, will not be allowed to move into any other places they don't have right now in the Western Hemisphere. So you can keep the colonies you have right now, but Europeans are not allowed to colonize any other places in the Americas. So his formal statement is that the Americas are closed to new European colonization, and that the United States would view any European attempt to oppress or control any of these newly emergent Latin American nations as a direct and hostile act toward the United States itself. And that's a very big statement. So that's like saying if Portugal tries to reconquer some part of southern Brazil, that the United States would see that as a direct attack on the United States. So that's pretty far-fetched in a lot of ways. I mean, Argentina and Brazil are thousands of miles away from the United States. They have their own histories and their own developments, which largely have never impacted much of the United States. So for the U.S. president to come out and say something like this really reveals several important things about the way the United States looks at Latin America, which is basically that the United States believes that it kind of owns the Western Hemisphere, that the United States is going to be the dominant power in the West, in the Americas, and that it should, if not just lead all these newly independent American nations into their new eras of freedom and liberty and whatnot, but the United States should show them how to be independent and how to build up their own economies or power or what have you. But possibly that the United States might want to control those areas for itself. So the U.S. is already thinking about Latin America as kind of like its own backyard. Like the United States kind of has default control or influence over Latin America just because the United States is in the Americas. So that tells us some very important things about the way the U.S. government is already looking at the rest of the Americas, even in the 1820s. So the United States leaders and congressmen and senators and newspaper reporters and other kind of political thinkers and intellectuals and people who kind of think about foreign policy in the world and all these types of things, people in the United States took this very seriously. The U.S. government took this very seriously. Even though the United States government didn't really have much of an army at the time, had just finished losing a giant war against Britain, the so-called War of 1812, that was fought in the 18 teens. So the United States didn't have much of an army, didn't have a whole huge amount of government revenue, tax revenue coming in on a yearly basis, and in fact just pretty much lost the last war it tried to fight against any European power just 10 years before. So for the United States to make this kind of statement and believe that they can actually back it up is kind of a pipe dream that the United States are thinking about the world in this way. So the United States really lacks the power to enforce these demands not just against Europeans, but possibly also against Latin Americans themselves. Um, and the United States government largely doesn't even try to enforce these demands against Europeans decade after decade until at least the 1870s. So that's 50 years later. That's a couple of generations later, as the United States will build up its economic and military power to eventually make the attempt at enforcing the thing. So this statement is taken very seriously inside the United States itself, but not really anywhere else. Latin Americans and Europeans may have read about this idea, but they mostly ignored it because, again, the United States didn't have the political, military, or economic power to enforce these demands or try to even negotiate a deal like this. So the United States, for the most part, will try to rely on other powers or negotiate with other powers to try to get the enforcement of these ideas. But the Europeans are mostly not interested. The Latin Americans are very much not interested in being controlled by the United States. But again, this gives us a window into kind of long-term U.S. leaders planning and thinking about what the U.S. relationship to Latin America would be, or what they would hope it to be, which obviously is very different from what Latin Americans thought about it. All right, and that sends us into the next kind of stage of U.S. relationships with Latin America. So going into the 1830s, one thing we need to understand about the United States that may kind of help us explain why U.S. leaders would think in that way is that the U.S. leaders and generally the U.S. population just assumes that it's going to keep gobbling up more and more land and become the dominant power in the Americas. It's just like something that people think is just going to happen almost inevitably. So, and that goes back pretty far into U.S. history, way back into the colonial era, when what would become the United States in the 1700s, when those colonies first get going along the eastern coastline of the Atlantic Ocean. So the so-called 13 colonies. They start off as just coastal little cities and towns, but gradually expand by the end of the 1700s into the size of the map that you see here. So they have been gobbling up more and more land for going on 200 years, and they did use a lot of kind of bribery and military attack and repression, especially against natives, to get that land. So by the early 1800s, there's just this assumption that, of course, that's going to continue. The United States will continue gobbling up more land, going further and further west. And in the early 1800s, I mean, this is a map of the United States kind of first territories in the 1780s, 1790s. But in the early 1800s, they're actually actively doing it. One of the biggest steps was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, when the United States agreed to buy this giant Louisiana territory here in this map in the yellow section all the way down to New Orleans. They just bought it one day from France. It was a French colony, and the French government didn't really want it anymore and was looking to sell. So the United States government just paid them for it. And the day that this treaty was finished, the United States doubled its land size, I mean, virtually overnight. So that's a gigantic growth of the territory to dominate much of North America. And U.S. leaders didn't want to stop there. In the 18 teens, they conquer and generally take control of Florida from Spain. Then in the opposite corner of North America, they start looking at the so-called Oregon Territory as ripe for purchase or conquest or something else. And U.S. leaders also thought that their taking control over all of Canada was at some point pretty inevitable. And they in fact tried it in the 1780s and again in the 18 teens. That's why they went to war largely with Britain in the 18 teens. They didn't go and attack London. They attacked Canada because they wanted to conquer it and turn it into U.S. territory. So the U.S. leaders in the early 1800s are looking at North America at the very least as an inevitable, unstoppable growth of U.S. territory to basically control the whole continent. So, of course, many Americans, or at least some Americans in leadership, are also looking at Latin America with the same general assumption. That once the U.S. gets control over North America, it should and probably inevitably will spread its control down further south into Latin America, and possibly some American leaders dream one day of the United States just outright controlling and owning all the land in the Americas, every island, every continent. So they're thinking very, very big on a worldwide scope. And of course, by this point today, in the early 2000s, even getting into the mid 2000s, we know that that just hasn't happened. But even with the size the United States is now, it's something like the third biggest country in the world territorially. The United States, just as it is a massive territory compared to other states and governments throughout the world. So if it had conquered all of Canada and then moved further south and taken over the whole Americas, the United States would have been by far the biggest and most powerful country on the planet, without any doubt in the least. So this is what the United States planners and thinkers are, thinking about in the early 1800s. They're thinking about world domination for the long term. So that's their long-term project. They may not talk about it very openly, but it just appears by their actions and their assumptions that they think that's the direction the country is headed in. So the next step, kind of going into the 1820s, just before the so-called Monroe Doctrine is issued, one problem that the United States had with this Louisiana Territory is that it opens up the slavery question. By the early 1800s, a lot of northern states in the U.S. had started to outlaw slavery on their own state level. So they might permit the buying and selling of slaves, but the slaves have to be kind of moved out into another state. So by the 1820s, most of these northern states, kind of in this pinkish area on this map, have outlawed slavery, whereas the southern states in these greenish areas have kept slavery. So you have a kind of social and economic big difference. And in 1820, a new state called Missouri, right smack in the middle of this map, this kind of greenish area, MO, was ready to be admitted as a formal state into the United States. And that caused a lot of havoc in the United States politically, because before Missouri was admitted, they didn't really know what was going to happen with all the rest of what on this map is called the Missouri Territory, which is basically all the leftover Louisiana territory. A lot of slave owners worried that if Missouri is admitted as a non-slavery state, then that would set the example that all the rest of the Louisiana Territory and maybe any other territories that the U.S. conquered will only be allowed to be free states, that slavery will stop where it is. So what the slave interests wanted, the pro-slavery slave owners wanted, is to get Missouri in as a state, but at the same time draw a line that would say where future slavery states would be allowed to exist. And if I can get my little arrow in here, in what's called the Missouri Compromise of 1820, they draw this line right along the southern border of Missouri. And it's pretty much an imaginary line. And they say that any land south of this line will be open to slavery. Any land north of it will not be allowed to have slavery after Missouri is admitted as a state. So Missouri will get in as a slave state, and after that, anything below this line will be open to slavery. Anything above it will not be open to slavery, will be closed. So, a fairly logical person would look at this map and say, hey, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of land, a lot more land north of that line, going up to the Canadian border. So what does this mean that this line exists right here for the way that U.S. leaders, and particularly Southerners, look at the future of the United States? They look at it as, we've got to conquer more territory further south of this line. And they say this line is going to go out kind of in perpetuity, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean at least. So they're not just drawing it to kind of here where the border with Mexico is. They say this is going to keep going all across the globe at that certain kind of parallel. What that tells us is a lot of slave owners are going to look to conquer land and get more states like Florida south of that line to get more slavery states. So what does that mean? They're going to start looking at areas in Mexico for conquest. Then they're going to start looking at Caribbean islands for conquest and possibly even further south. So a lot of the slave owners have now a vested interest in possibly trying to buy or conquer territory south of that line to get more slave states to balance out the vast amount of states that will probably be carved out of the remaining Louisiana territory. So that was just something about the Missouri Territory and the Missouri Compromise. Right when, in the few years around when the Monroe Doctrine is announced in 1823. Remember, that's just 3 years after this Missouri Compromise. So that's again how U.S. leaders are thinking. This is a major motivation for several U.S. leaders to start looking at areas further south of that line as ripe for conquest. And the next step in all this is U.S. relationship with Mexico. So this is a map of Mexico at its independence in 1821. Most of the Mexican population is in the southern area where all these smaller Mexican states are. And the northern areas are much less populated. Even the Spanish colonists had had a hard time convincing anyone to really move out into these very sparsely populated areas. They're largely desertish. They were difficult to get to because you had to cross through major deserts. Even in what is today California, the state of California was sparsely populated, and the Spanish government could never figure out how to get enough colonists up there. They used to have to pay people to go to California, if you could believe it. The government would pay people to go live there for a while and start farms or do something or other, start a business. So by the time Mexico gets control of the area, it's still very sparsely populated. So most of the Mexican population is further south. And Mexico worried especially about this area here. It's a province called Texas. Again, because it's right on the border, right down here, on the border with what the U.S. owns, and the Mexican government is smart enough to look at what's happening in the United States and realize this is going to be one of the first places that any slave owning interests in the United States are going to conquer because it's below this Missouri Compromise line. So the Mexican government is already worried in the 1820s about the future of their province out here in this grayish area, which is Texas. So it's sparsely populated, and they're worried that the United States is going to try to conquer it at some point. So what do? They try to get people to move in. And the way they do that is to offer cheap land. So the Mexican government passes a law in 1825 that offers up to 4,000 acres of land for $200 US. Now, granted, back then $200 was very good money. So this would be like offering kind of if the United States or any government would offer someone and to, just put an offer out there for we have this area of our country that it's a small town, no one really lives there, but we want to build up the population, so the government's going to say offer an acre with a nice big house on it, maybe 2,000 square foot house, and they'll sell it to you for I don't know, $30,000, which in California prices that's ludicrous. In California for a 2,000 square foot house in the big cities you might pay $1 million. So it's a big difference in money. So it's seen as a really good investment opportunity for a lot of people who don't have a lot of money that might be able to get a loan for a little bit to go out and get their own land, start their own farms. And basically starting a farm back then was like starting your own business. And you could run your own farm and make your own money, and you're set because you went out to this area and got some very cheap land and got going on it. So that was Mexico's real great hope for Texas in the 1820s, was that they could sell a lot of this land very cheap and attract population to go there. The downside is that the largest amount of people who went into this place for the cheap land were actually people from the U.S. A lot of U.S. people emigrated into Mexico, into the Texas province, because of the cheap land. And a lot of them are Southerners. So the population grows very quickly into around 30,000 residents or so in about 1830. But the vast amount of them, the vast majority of them, are people from the United States who seem to move into the area with the intent at some point of starting a revolution to break the area away from Mexico and deliver it as a gift to be made into a state of the United States. And the Mexican government is fairly aware of that. They're very angry about it, and they get even angrier when a lot of these people from the U.S. move into Mexico and then refuse to follow Mexican laws. U.S. Immigrants are pretty insulting to Catholicism, which is a big deal in Mexico. And even more insulting, a lot of these U.S. Southerners bring slaves into Mexico. And Mexico had made slavery illegal. So a lot of these people from the United States are moving into Mexico, bringing their slaves, which legally, whenever that happened, the slave would be immediately free because they're in a country where there is no slavery. But these people from the United States, these slave owners, try to keep their slaves enslaved against the law. So they're literally breaking the law once they step foot on the soil on Mexican land and try to keep their slaves. So the Mexican government got very concerned about this, obviously, by 1830, and started to try to enforce their laws, which tended to piss off a lot of the white slave owners who had moved in. And those white settlers from the United States start getting so angry about the laws being enforced against them that they start issuing the same complaints from the American Revolution that the government is oppressing us and it's a tyranny and whatnot, which is always entertaining to listen to from slave owners. So a lot of these white settlers from the United States started a revolt against Mexico in 1832 with the very clear goal of breaking Texas away from Mexico as an independent country and then joining the United States as a U.S. state. The Mexican government pretty quickly put down that revolt in 1832, but then an even bigger one broke out in 1835, 1836. So there are going to be several major battles. The Texas revolutionaries are much more organized by 1835. They basically learned the lessons from a few years before. So there's a series of major battles. The president of Mexico, Santa Anna, comes out with an army. He was a general before that, so he personally led an army, the president of the country, on the battlefield to defeat the Texas revolutionaries. And the Mexican government wins most of the battles. So like the Alamo in 1836, a whole bunch of the rest of them, but made some big mistakes at a battle called the Battle of San Jacinto, which is in eastern Texas out here, in April 1836. And at that battle, the Texan revolutionary, and they take the president of Mexico prisoner. And they offer him a pretty clear choice. They put a paper in front of him that says that Texas will be independent and that the Mexican government allows this. And they tell him that he will either sign it or they will kill him. So Santa Anna signs it, not surprisingly, and they let him go. So Texas from this point is an independent country and hopes to quickly get a treaty signed with the United States to become a U.S. state. That is very controversial, though, for U.S. leaders for several different reasons. And we see them in this list here. The first is that a lot of U.S. leaders worried that if they annex, which means formally take over, bring Texas into their country, that any annexation of Texas would immediately start a war with Mexico. Mexican leaders have been talking about reconquering Texas ever since that Battle of San Jacinto. And this is going on year after year after year. So this gets into the 1840s. So going on 5, 6, 7, 8 years where the U.S. government is not taking any action on this to the kind of great anger of the Texas revolutionaries who are very desperate because they exist as an independent country. They don't have a lot of resources or finances, so they are really desperate to become a U.S. state. But the Mexican government leaders realized that Texas was pretty weak and talked about pretty openly about reconquering Texas and bringing it back into Mexico at some point in the fairly soon future. So a lot of U.S. leaders were worried that with the Mexican government leaders talking about that so consistently over the years, that any U.S. attempt to take control of Texas would immediately cause a war to start with Mexico. Like, Mexico's not going to stand for this. They're going to start a war against us. Other U.S. leaders worried that if you take over Texas, then it's land that's south of that Missouri Compromise line, and that's going to be land that's open to slavery. So especially a lot of northern politicians who did not want to see slavery expand at all try to stop the U.S. from annexing, taking over Texas, just in order to try to stop slavery's growth and expansion territorially into new lands. And of course, many Southerners want exactly that. They want to get more land for slavery, and after that they're going to want to get more land. It's never going to really stop for them. So there's that political divide in the United States over annexing Texas. The northern anti-slavery interest want to stop it, and the southern pro-slavery interest want to make sure it happens. So for 10 years, the United States government just didn't really take any much of a stance at all, until we get an interesting guy come along. And his big kind of statement, his big promise to voters is that if he's elected president, he is going to bring Texas into the country as a U.S. state. And that gets a lot of excitement going. So Polk wins the Democratic nomination for president in 1844 on those lines, and then starts his major campaign against the other party in the general election. And his campaign slogan is 5440 and the annexation of Texas. So it's kind of a mouthful for a political slogan today. It's a lot of historians look at it as kind of funny, but it was like a catchphrase for back then, and it worked apparently. We know what the annexation of Texas means. Polk is promising if he's elected president of the United States, he will go after Texas and bring it into the country. What really does 5440 mean? 5440 is a line on the map. It's one of these I think it's longitudinal lines. And 5440 is a reference to the Oregon territories. If I can get my pointer going here. So the United States already owns pretty much all this stuff in blue up to about here. This is all the old Louisiana Purchase territory. Texas is down here. All this is still part of Mexico. And there's this disputed area up here called the Oregon Territory. There's a bunch of U.S. settlers up there. There's a bunch of British settlers around there. There's even some French and even some Russian settlements up along the coastline. So, and this area up here is all a British colony, generally referred to as Canada. So, with 5440, Polk is demanding as a presidential campaign promise that if he's elected president, the United States is not just going to annex Texas and bring that into the country. The United States is also going to go after Oregon and try to get territory up to the 5440 line on the map, which interestingly is not the current agreed upon border with Canada, just kind of stretched out to the ocean. 5440 is actually way up here, which is always been part of British Canada, and it's not even disputed. It's not even controversial that this is part of the British colony of Canada. So for Polk to say that we're going after Oregon territory all the way up to 5440, that is a conquest of British-owned territory that everyone in the world has admitted that Britain owns this outright. So saying 5440 or fight, which means we're going to get this land up to this line, or we're going to start a war, which it basically means we're going to invade Canada and conquer all this stuff up here in this purplish blob, all up to 5440, at the same time is trying to annex Texas, which will probably cause a war against Mexico at the same time. So this presidential candidate is saying, if I'm elected president, I'm going to try to start two wars in two different places against two different countries, one of them being Britain, the biggest and most powerful military power on the planet. And that's his campaign slogan. And amazingly, and I'm never will end being surprised at this, it worked. The guy got elected president of the United States. So he gets inaugurated as president in March 1845. Presidents back then were inaugurated in March instead of January. And he immediately starts doing everything he can to provoke a war with Mexico. He, in December 1845, offers full annexation to Texas. Well, in the spring, he offers annexation. By December, it's accomplished. The U.S. has passed a law saying that Texas is now part of the United States, which obviously angers Mexico. When the Mexican government asked to negotiate this with the U.S. government, Polk and his negotiators attempted and succeeded at totally destroying those negotiations. And then Polk cut all diplomatic ties with Mexico, recalled the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, and sent the U.S. Army into some disputed areas in Texas, on the Texas border with Mexico, in order to try to provoke a war. So, I mean, that is really beyond the pale of almost anything any other president in U.S. history had done to that point. Actively insulting a foreign country and then putting a giant army right on the border with that foreign country, just trying to provoke them into doing something. And again, it works. The U.S., big chunk of the U.S. Army is right on the Mexican border by early 1846, and Mexico also puts one of its big chunks of its own army on that same border, saying that they're defending their own territory against possible U.S. invasion. And whenever you get two armies, or two military, big chunks of a military, foreign and hostile powers that close to each other, you're asking for trouble. Because soldiers are tough guys, and they often yell insults to each other, and they do insulting things to each other, and that starts little kind of barroom fights and stuff like that. And if you got barroom fights between two soldiers from two different opposing armies, that could quickly expand into an actual battle. And that's exactly what happened in 1846. Some skirmishing starts between the two armies, and that breaks out into actual battles. And at that point, President Polk tells Congress, Mexico is attacking us and we need to declare war in order to defend ourselves. So this is all very controversial stuff. Congress didn't really want to do that, but once the fighting started, kind of U.S. patriotism kicked in, and how dare they attack us and all that kind of stuff. So the United States will start a movement to go to war with Mexico in spring of 46. Even as Mexico is asking to negotiate, even when Polk recalled his own ambassador, his formal ambassador to Mexico, he sent one of his friends, basically, a guy named John Slidell, to Mexico City with some kind of, as like the president's personal envoy or something like that. Publicly, Polk said that he's sending Slidell to Mexico City in order to kind of calm things down and avoid a war, but historians have since found the personal letters that Polk wrote to Slidell before he left, with very clear instructions. And one of the big quotes from one of those letters is telling Slidell that your real purpose is to, quote, throw all responsibility and odium of the failure of negotiations on the Mexican government, which basically means go down there, insult them when they want to start negotiating a peace treaty to avoid war, insult them, make bigger demands than you ever believe that they're willing to give into. Just do everything you can to convince them to start a war. And that's what happened. The war started. So here's a map of Mexico before the war began. So U.S. forces basically invade. And they don't just go to Texas to kind of defend Texas. They actually attacked further in along the Rio Grande border. A lot of the Texans said that the Rio Grande was the normal border between the province of Texas and the rest of Mexico. But Mexico said it was actually another river that was further up. So there's this huge disputed territory that the U.S. Army and the Mexican Army is going to fight over for a little while. But interestingly, the United States does not only send an army to that area, they also send an army further west all the way to California because they want California. They want land all the way to the ocean. They want all of this. And because this is so sparsely populated and there's virtually zero Mexican troops in California, the conquest of California is completed by the end of 1847. Since the war is not going as well in this border area, the U.S. Army is really trying to hope to gain control of that border area and then attack even further south toward Mexico City to force an end to the war on U.S. terms. When that war didn't go so well, the U.S. sent a marine landing basically to Veracruz and Mexico City on a kind of circular route basically. And they do conquer Mexico City in September 1847. And that is what forces the Mexican government to negotiate a peace treaty that basically gives all of the western lands plus everything that the U.S. wants for Texas to the United States. And that becomes known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the United States didn't just take this land at the point of the gun. They paid Mexico about $15 million for all these territories stretching all the way to the ocean. That $15 million might sound like a lot of money, and it was a lot of money back then, but it was a pittance compared to the vast amount of acreage that the United States took control of through this war. So the amount of money that the United States paid Mexico for all this land, some historians basically call it blood money, where a lot of U.S. leaders felt guilty for allowing Polk to have started this war and really victimized Mexico. And the United States will also, a little bit later, buy this little strip of land kind of down here in very northern Mexico to kind of stabilize the border. And that'll be the last kind of addition of land to the United States. At the same time, the threat of war, Polk's threat to go to war with Britain really scared Britain for whatever reason. I'd never even researched that. But the British and the United States immediately start negotiating about Oregon. And the decision is basically the British allow the United States to take control over the whole Oregon territory. And they just extend the border with Canada from further east all the way out to basically to the ocean. So it's a major amount of land to try to control, populate, make productive and profitable. And the slave owners don't want to stop there. They also are still looking at the possibility of conquering areas further south or buying or whatever. So they're largely looking at Cuba at first because it's closest to Florida, but they start looking at the Latin American Caribbean islands. They say, well, maybe Britain will sell Jamaica to us, or maybe Spain will sell Cuba or Puerto Rico to us, or maybe we just have to get an army together and start invading these places and just taking them flat out. The United States already still hated the idea that Haiti existed. The Dominican Republic was fairly weak. So there's a lot of kind of rampant opportunities out there for more expansion. And a lot of the southern slave owners talk about that pretty openly because they want more land open to slavery south of that line. So there is some political discussion about going after those southern areas, but it's not really that heavily considered. For two reasons. Number one, if you're going to launch a war or buy the place, you have to get the Northerners to vote for that. And the Northerners realize what the game is. It's the Southerners trying to get more land for slavery. So a lot of the Northern U.S. politicians are very resistant to any further conquest in the South because they just don't spread slavery anymore. And also because the Southerners themselves, the slave owners, are themselves very, very heavily racist. They do not want non-white people in the country. The only non-white people they want are slaves. So how are you going to invade and conquer Cuba and automatically turn all those people living in Cuba into slaves or kick them out of that island? It's just kind of logistically difficult. So some Southern leaders really dream on this idea of going into Latin America and conquering, but a lot of even pro-slavery Southerners are very resistant to it because they're so racist. One way that the 1800s is really kind of special and in some ways spectacular is that there's a new growth in scientific knowledge and scientific research. We'll get more into the Industrial Revolution a little bit later. But the Industrial Revolution really pushes a lot of scientific development because there's a lot of profit to be made by more efficient factories and better minerals and chemicals and stuff like that. So there's a lot of scientific research being applied to kind of worldly problems or business profits or something like this. And that generally promotes science as something that people think about and are interested in. So racists are also very interested in science in order to basically prove their racist ideas. And there is one kind of pseudoscience, which is what historians call it's not a real science. It's something that people who are looking for proof for their racism latched onto as, quote, scientific type of evidence for their proof, for their racist ideas. And this becomes known as phrenology. And phrenology is basically the study of brain structure and especially the size of a person's skull. The idea is that people with bigger skulls therefore have bigger and more complicated brains, which means that they think on higher levels than people with smaller skulls, which means they have smaller and less complex brains. So a lot of so-called scientists start running around the world and measuring the size of people's skulls in different populations and different cultures, and obviously with different skin tones. And they keep saying that they notice that white Europeans and other Caucasians from Russia or somewhere like that, or the United States, by and large, according to their statistical studies, have bigger skull sizes, which means that Caucasians have bigger brains, which means they say that Caucasians and white people are more capable of complex intellectual thought and organization. So that seems to be kind of, for a lot of people who want to believe in this stuff, it seems to be statistical scientific evidence that the white race is more advanced, more highly evolved than the darker skin tone races of the world. And of course, all this is crap. It's science. It's what generally happens when a researcher starts off with an idea that they want to prove, something they already believe in that they're looking for evidence for, and so of course they're going to go out and find evidence for it. The problem in that is that's not really research. Research means that you kind of ask a question and then you do the research and study it objectively and let the research tell you what is true. So you research as many different sources as you possibly can to answer the question, and you make up your own mind according to where the evidence lies, which is very different from, I have an idea, what kind of evidence can I find to prove it? Because that means you're only going to find evidence to back up what you believe. You're going to ignore all the other evidence that exists out there. So that's like the opposite of good research. But that's what these so-called scientists were running around doing. And this idea of phrenology gets into the popular culture. And a lot of people who don't really know much about science start to believe this stuff. So a lot of these racists will start to say that the only way that the so-called lesser races can possibly progress or get better is basically through evolution. They have to somehow, over time, increase their skull sizes and their brain complexity, just like white people had for somehow through eons of time, in order to kind of attain the heights of the white race or some madness like that. Basically, it also means that as the other races exist now, they can never achieve the high level of thinking that whites can. So whites should basically rule the world, and all the other darker skin tone people are more naturally evolved to do kind of like menial labor and easy tasks and things like that don't take a lot of like brain work, that don't take a lot of personal thought. So send them out to dig holes or trenches, or do whatever, pick food out of the ground, or do the farming or something like that. Whereas the white people sit in the house reading books and holding political debates or something. It's just all madness. But those are the kinds of secondary results you get from these kinds of theories. And of course, that also feeds into these political ideas that phrenology says that in politics, there's a lot of people who want to abolish slavery in the United States and other places. And phrenology says, no, you shouldn't really abolish slavery, and you definitely shouldn't allow any kind of interbreeding, any intermarriage, and kind of racially mixed children, because it could take centuries for the lesser races to evolve larger skull sizes, and all you're going to do is produce children that have skulls and brains that are smaller and weaker than those children would have had if they had two fully white parents. So this also justifies a whole lot of segregation and oppression and just separation of the races whenever possible. And that's why also you see in kind of Victorian British culture, the upper class always talks about good breeding, and they're very obsessed with people from one class should only intermarry among their own class, and that's where you get a lot of these kind of Jane Austen type romances about I'm in love with somebody but they're from a different class and so I can never marry them, and all these kinds of things. But it also impacts U.S. foreign policy. So there's a lot of Americans who think that the United States should conquer more land, should expand freedom and liberty for other peoples. But some of these phrenologists say, well, wait a minute, you might be able to expand for more land, but you should not be taking in the so-called lesser races, because they're not smart enough to live in the United States responsibly. What are you going to do? Conquer Cuba and make all these Cuban people that are darker skinned and therefore are not as smart into American voting citizens? You can't do that because they're not smart enough to be able to vote. They can't make decisions for themselves. They have smaller brains. So they are incapable of living in democracy responsibly. And who knows who they're going to elect? Decisions who can't make their own decisions, it's going to be madness. So it also says that if you're going to conquer a place with all those people, you're going to have to colonize them, basically. Which means that that'll do harm to the democracy overall in the United States, because the United States started off as an anti-imperial revolution, a revolution against the British. So you can't really turn around on that and say we want to still be a great democracy, but now we're going to go out and conquer these foreign areas, but we're not going to make the people we conquer into citizens who vote. We're going to make them into kind of like workers or something, and we're going to decide their leaders and their laws for them. I mean, that's oppression. That's not democracy. So a lot of U.S. Political leaders start saying maybe we shouldn't try to conquer any land that has anyone in it anyway. All these big populations in Latin America, we shouldn't even try to conquer them because we can't make them into voting citizens, and we don't really want to rule over them like a tyranny. So maybe we should just stop those attempts at conquest in the first place. So maybe we should really just go after land that doesn't really have anyone in it. And of course, a lot of these racist beliefs also do some psychological things for white people, especially in the United States. It justifies a lot of their previous actions and beliefs. So number one with this list, we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution next time, but one thing about the Industrial Revolution is it displaced a lot of people. A lot of people left farms that their families have maybe lived on for who knows how long, and left everything they had ever known behind to go work in these very complex factories in these bustling cities with all this pollution, all these things. And that caused a lot of psychological harm to a lot of people who tried it. So some historians have written that all those kind of psychological insecurities that people, especially in the United States, had regarding industrialization, that their racist beliefs made them feel at least a little bit better about themselves. I may be living in this industrial slum, working in a horrible factory for starvation wages, but at least my brain is bigger than all these non-white people. It also, these racist ideas and this phrenology, kind of pseudo-scientific evidence, also gives a justification for forcing immigrants, especially non-white immigrants, or maybe less white immigrants, or however you want to define that, to force any immigrants coming into the United States to rigidly adhere to U.S. cultural norms and social norms and economic norms. So there's a demand that immigrants learn to speak English, that they attend certain types of religious ceremonies, that they are fully involved in the capitalist society. I mean, all these kinds of things. And there's a lot of anger against immigrants who try to kind of live in ethnic enclaves where Italian or German or something is spoken instead of English. So this phrenology will kind of provide a somewhat scientific justification for forcing people to adhere to U.S. norms. And it also provides a justification for destroying major other world civilizations, like enslaving the Africans, going genocidal against the natives, and conquering and oppressing Mexican societies in the lands that the U.S. had taken from Mexico. It's really hard to justify doing that politically if you believe that those groups are also full-fledged, fully equal people. So phrenology gave some evidence to make the American government, the U.S. government, or U.S. population feel a little bit better about the crimes that they were committing against other peoples in neighboring countries or places that they had conquered. And of course, they also feel pretty good that it's okay to destroy all those races through enslavement or genocide or whatever, because phrenology says, well, they have smaller brains and they're just going to kind of be weaker and weaker and peter out eventually anyway. So who really cares about killing them or enslaving them or anything like that? That's just kind of their natural place in the pecking order of life. And if they die off as kind of a race or a species, then oh well, the weak died off, and the strong, dominant, big-brained white people are going to continue to rule the world. So there's a whole lot of heavy racism floating around the United States, and in Europe, and in some Latin American societies. So, for instance, the Mexican government is very racist against its indigenous population, and many Latin American governments are, and some of them still remain so to this day. Part of this kind of racist thinking will not so much be applied to racism, but applied to just the general population. And this comes out of something called social Darwinism, which comes out of Darwinism. Darwin's natural selection theory is all about living longer and having more offspring reliably. That's it. And Darwin first did this voyage, I think, in like the 1820s or something, and that's the voyage that got him kind of thinking about natural selection. He started writing down his ideas, and because he was rich, he didn't have to go back to a job or anything in Britain. So he basically traveled around to other places around the world and took careful notes on other examples of natural selection amongst animals or birds in different environments that he found. And he put all this stuff together over a good 20 or 30 years into this giant book called On the Origin of Species. And eventually he got that book published in 1859. And that's where the idea of natural selection really hit the rest of the world. Becomes a big intellectual fad of the late 1800s. Right after his book came out, a lot of intellectuals, college professors and researchers, and a lot of people read this book and applied that natural selection idea to a lot of different kinds of disciplines. And one of them is a philosophy guy named Herbert Spencer, who his big idea is to take this survival of the fittest and apply it to human society in what Spencer would call social Darwinism. So his idea is basically that this competition for survival happens within human populations, amongst nations, amongst states, cities, towns, communities. And his idea is really fairly simple, that individuals within a society struggle and compete with each other for wealth, power, dominance. And his idea is that, in theory, as they are competing with each other, those that were born with a kind of abnormality that makes them kind of physically stronger, they tend to rise to the top of society. Physical strength or mental strength, some people that are just better at learning stuff from a book than others. I mean, we all have our proclivities. I found that I'm good at music and gardening and this history stuff. I can pick up a history book and read it and get a fairly decent understanding of it. Not everyone's very good at that. They need it explained to them over and over again. Just like I can't pick up a math book and read that. That's like written in a foreign language that I cannot understand. I need it explained to me over and over and over again before it kind of penetrates into my brain. And even then, a lot of times it doesn't work. And same thing with foreign languages. I know people that they just listen to some foreign people talking on tape and they just pick up the language. Not my brain. My brain needs to be constantly exposed to it on an everyday basis just to get the gist of it. But that's not my proclivity. So, but Darwin talked, or not Darwin, but Spencer talked about this and said that the people who have these kind of just natural abnormalities that make them physically stronger or better at book learning or talented in some other way, or some people that are just born with like a super hard work ethic where they never take a day off and they're always obsessed with their goals. Those are the kind of people, through competition with all the other people in their population, that are not as strong or as smart or talented or hardworking, that the strongest rise to positions of wealth, strength, and power in human society. And he says it's a good thing. He says it's good that the strongest and the smartest tend to rise to the top. And he says basically, through this social Darwinism idea, we should allow it to happen. We should not put limits on the amount of strength and power and dominance that these super talented people that rise to the top, we shouldn't put a ceiling on them. We should let them go further and further, because they're going to lead us into, whatever great developments that they can think of. So they're going to lead us into the next wave of technology, or the next great political solutions, or whatever they're going to do, the next great dance trend, or the next great style of music or art, or whatever it is. So they're the ones who get rich and powerful. But there's also a downside to this theory. What happens to everybody else? What happens to the people that are not born with great strength or a great book learning intelligence? And he says pretty much the same thing. Let them fall to the bottom. That they're just kind of genetically weaker, or their proclivities are not as strong, and they're never gonna. Not only are they not going to rise to the top, but they probably won't even stick in the middle. They're going to fall to the bottom. And Herbert Spencer basically says, let it happen. So this is kind of an inherently conservative theory in just natural results in the real world. It basically dehumanizes people that are poor, because it says they're poor because it's their own fault. They're stupid, lazy, and weak. Wage laborers who don't make a lot of money, they're in that position because they didn't work hard enough, or they weren't smart enough to get out of that position. And also, for the people at the top, he says that you should not really take much from them. They earn everything they accumulate, and so it is wrong for government to raise high taxes on them, to take a lot of their income. That they deserve everything they get because they outcompeted everybody else. And the one thing he really doesn't want is for government to tax the rich in order to help the poor. He says, why would you do that? Why would you take from the people who have earned and accomplished and achieved in order to help the weak survive? He says, basically, let them starve. It will be better for humankind to let the weak and the poor go and let them just be annihilated through competition than for government to do anything to help them survive. So, I mean, this theory is still around today. It's not always called social Darwinism. It's called a lot of different things. But it's still an inherently conservative theory today. Do not tax the rich. Do not help the poor. And so you, depending on the year that you're listening to this, you probably see this in U.S. politics. It's pretty prevalent in U.S. politics, actually. But again, this social Darwinism label isn't always attached to it. It's often called something else. Darwin himself hated the idea that this was called social Darwinism. Darwin said, no, my book talked about kind of birds and plants and stuff. I didn't talk anything about human society in that book, so don't use my name. But Spencer used the name and it stuck, so there's that. And this also has bigger effects, not just in the United States or these conservative countries that will go with this theory, which the United States very much does in the late 1800s, and many other countries did. But this will also have an effect on U.S. imperialism and its stance toward Latin America, because this idea, this social Darwinism idea, will eventually lead to theories of what becomes known in the late 1800s as degeneration. That if you help the poor, and especially if like the working class starts to intermarry with the rich, then that will just, and they have offspring, then the offspring, much like the racist phrenology idea, the offspring will be like this mixture of really good and really bad, so they'll just be kind of average at best. At worst, if you're from the rich elite group and you marry down, and you marry kind of poor people or middle class people or whatever you want to call them, working class, then your children with that person might inherit some of those lower class traits. So they might inherit a smaller skull size and a smaller brain, or a weaker physical body, or a weaker work ethic, or whatever. They will degenerate over time. They will not evolve to a higher level. They will de-evolve to a lower level. And eventually, by the 1900s, you start getting this idea of international Darwinism, that you don't just have competition amongst individuals or families or whatever in one given society, like a city or a state or a nation. You have international Darwinism, survival of the fittest government or the fittest nation. So countries are in international struggle against each other. And the most efficient, the strongest, or the smartest will be the one that survives and dominates the globe. And the weaker, dumber, just less efficient countries will kind of fall down and be conquered themselves, or be controlled, or might just completely go out of existence. So in the late 1800s, you have this a lot of literature that talks about certain countries are like, they have an internal disease in their society that makes their government weak, or their government making decisions is a symbol of their political sickness or something like that. So you have a lot of kind of bodily maladies that are applied to government decisions. And of course the Europeans mostly apply that to other people outside of Europe, because the Europeans think that they're the white ones with the big brains, so they're the best. But there are a lot of degeneration theorists even in Europe who worry that people in France are getting kind of thinner and thinner and shorter, and they're kind of physically displaying all these degenerative traits, and their nation is getting weaker. And who knows, maybe the British will conquer us someday and we'll all be speaking English and eating fish and chips instead of speaking French, and eating crepes or whatever. So there's a lot of kind of political and social and cultural fears that feed into this degeneration idea and this social Darwinism and phrenology and all this other crap science along with it. It's not really science. I shouldn't even call it that. It's just crap. So there's a lot of racism floating around. There's a lot of fear of degeneration, and that kind of feeds into especially how the United States is looking at Latin America as a place for possible future conquest or control, or whatever they're thinking about. So a lot of American leaders will use these theories to justify what they already want to do to Latin America one way or the other. And that leads us into the last section, the beginnings of economic and corporate penetration of Latin America. Basically, U.S. companies and their money going into Latin America, trying to figure out ways to influence or outright control Latin American countries for one reason or another. So U.S. companies first start to penetrate Latin America largely in the 1840s. And that's largely with investments. U.S. companies will go into a lot of these countries and buy up land, or try to acquire some resource that their company depends on. So a lot of them are U.S. fruit companies that want to buy up land in Latin America, where the climate is very temperate, and you can grow fruit year round because there's not much of a heavy winter in a lot of these places because they're so close to the equator. So a lot of U.S. fruit companies go into Latin America and start buying up land, growing bananas or other kinds of fruit or whatever. The biggest and most famous one that gets going in the mid-1800s is called the United Fruit Company. A lot of these earlier corporations didn't have very creative titles. United Fruit Company, I didn't really tell you much about the company. And the United Fruit Company's history is pretty interesting, and historians have studied it and written several books on it that reveal a lot of kind of disgusting things about that company and its oppression and use of racism in not just the U.S. but other countries. And it's interesting because after the 1970s, the United Fruit Company became Chiquita, which obviously is still a dominant banana producing and selling company today. If you go into any kind of grocery store or something in the United States and look at the banana aisle, Chiquita tends to dominate a whole bunch of it. It's largely Chiquita or Dole today. They're pretty monopolistic. But other U.S. companies will go into other countries and other regions looking to produce different products, largely agriculture-based products like sugar or coffee, bananas. After the 1900s, U.S. oil companies will start going into places like Venezuela when a giant oil reserve is found in Venezuela in the early 1900s. So you get U.S. companies like Royal Dutch Shell, Gulf, and Standard Oil, and they will have a major presence in Latin America at least by 1920, and especially in places like Venezuela where they have giant oil reserves. And as oil is discovered throughout Latin America for the rest of the 1900s, those companies will go into those places also. So several historians have gotten interested in the past 20 years or so, since about the year 2000, in studying the history of these companies and how they made decisions. Before the historians wrote those books, there was a lot of assumptions amongst historians that U.S. companies really waited for the U.S. government to go and kind of colonize a place, and then the companies would follow. What historians have found recently is exact opposite. The U.S. companies actually go into foreign countries first and buy up land or whatever other resource they're after, bribe politicians to start forming alliances and partnerships and whatnot. And they really set up the groundwork. They lay the groundwork for a later government attempt at takeover or colonization or invasion or whatever particularly happens in that place. So historians are finding that it's very largely U.S. companies that go into foreign nations first and work out deals. And if there's a kind of crisis with those deals a few decades later, then the U.S. government will come in to kind of conquer or control the whole country and justify that by saying, well, we're just protecting our U.S.-based businesses that have been there for a while. And a lot of these U.S. companies really get going in about the mid-1800s, especially in Latin America. And they get going in a lot of interesting ways. Some historians have even studied their labor policies. So especially after 1848, U.S. companies, when they go into a foreign country like, say, Venezuela or Nicaragua or wherever, a lot of these companies' policies is to hire workers from many different ethnic backgrounds to work for the company in that one place. And then they show favoritism through promotions or through higher wages or something like that to just one of those ethnic groups of their workforce in order to incite hatred amongst the whole workforce. Because if only 20% of your workers in Nicaragua are ethnic Caribbean islanders who have come to Nicaragua to get a job, if you show favoritism to that 20% and 50% of another 50% of the workforce is native Nicaraguan, another, I don't know, 10% is from Mexico or something like that, but you only show favoritism to that 20% of Caribbeans, then the rest of the workers are going to be really pissed off. And if you're really good at this, you can convince them to not be pissed off at you as the employer, but to be pissed off at the Caribbeans. So you get the workers to hate and oppose each other, which you can use to basically destroy any attempts at worker solidarity or unionization or any kind of worker demands for higher wages or better treatment or really anything. And U.S. companies found the best way to do that is to make sure that the different ethnic backgrounds have very different skin tones. So you hire some African immigrants to come in and you line them up to work with, I don't know, immigrants from Mexico or something like that in El Salvador. And they don't even have to even talk to each other to see who the favoritism's going to. They just look at the skin tone. So there's a lot of use of racism and incitement of racism amongst the workforce in order to control the workforce. And again, because a lot of these companies are involved in Latin American countries from the mid-1800s, that will help convince the U.S. government and some companies sometimes to later offer massive money as loans for infrastructure in the country that these companies are in. So, for example, the United States, some companies went into Panama and started building up a corporate presence in Panama. And a lot of this is seen as kind of like a U.S. corporate experiment. The U.S. government's allowing its companies to go in there first to see if it's possible to try to control the Panamanian workforce and build these big profit-making companies. But a lot of times the companies say, well, we're here in Panama and our business is growing, but what we really need is a big infrastructure project like a railroad. Or eventually, after the 1900s get going, like an electricity producing factory or a dam or some gigantic project that really requires government financing, because no individual company can afford to build something that large themselves, or they just don't want to try. They want to use someone else's money. So a lot of times they will try to convince the U.S. government or some kind of international bank or something to come in and give a giant loan to, say, the Panamanian government, so that the government can build a railroad so that the companies can continue growing, hiring more people, and have prosperity. So this actually happened in Panama. A thing called the Panamanian Railroad got built. The next step, maybe a decade or two later, is that the U.S. government then starts to worry that, okay, we've got our companies in that place, they're making a lot of money, they're providing tax revenue to the U.S. government, it's a very prosperous situation, but what happens if the Panamanian government decides that it wants to take over the railroad or kick foreigners out of the country or something like that? Then the U.S. government feels a responsibility that it has to militarily protect its companies that have invested so heavily in this foreign country, which often leads the U.S. government kind of try to control those foreign governments or push them around or even invade and completely conquer them and just take over, which is imperialism. So many historians have written that these companies going in and hiring workers and starting prosperity in a foreign country is really just the first step that eventually leads toward flat out U.S. imperialism over that place in maybe decades later, and that it's a long-term process. And historians have written that basically U.S. companies tend to build or create or lay the groundwork for the empires that the U.S. government will eventually build, especially in Latin America. And a lot of this is very reliant on the Industrial Revolution, especially these giant loans, because the Industrial Revolution is a kind of wave of technology that builds on itself. So it's not like you can just go build a railroad in the 1840s and that railroad is still going to be the peak of efficiency 30 or 40 years later. Just like a cell phone in the early 1990s was like great technology back then, but you had to carry a backpack to power the thing. And 30 years later, a cell phone technology has gone way beyond that. So if you ever see someone walking around with a cell phone from 1992, it's kind of laughable. It's a joke. So technology feeds on itself, and technological advances go faster and faster. So the fact that a U.S. company went into a foreign country and started building technology or infrastructure projects really demands that that investment continues and more money gets spent to update that technology decade after decade. And that's kind of part of the theory of controlling foreign governments in the industrial age, that those governments have to keep taking on more and more loans, which puts them in debt and makes them controllable. And if they decide not to pay back the loans someday, then maybe a country invades them to take over and make sure those loans are paid. But we'll talk much more about that, just flat out U.S. imperialism, military conquest, after the exam and in the next kind of section of lectures after exam 1. So we'll stop here for today, and next time we'll talk in more detail about the Industrial Revolution itself, how it got going, how it progressed, and what the major criticisms of it were.